What if an entire system of belief vanished, not because it was forbidden, but because it was quietly replaced? What if faith once existed without churches, without priests, without sacred books imposed from above, and history later decided to pretend it never happened? Before we continue, I want you to think about this question and leave a comment with your first impression, because what follows challenges the way belief itself has been defined for centuries. If you find this kind of hidden history intriguing, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and write a comment sharing what you believe was truly erased from Tartaria. Your interaction keeps this investigation alive. Between 1700 and 1840, vast regions labeled on old maps as Tartaria were not united by cathedrals or temples, but by something far more subtle. Travelers, cartographers, and diplomats describe cities without dominant religious structures, societies without visible clergy, and communities where spiritual life appeared inseparable from daily existence. This absence was not interpreted as atheism. On the contrary, many accounts suggest a deep sense of order, ethics, and shared meaning, expressed not through sermons, but through architecture, civic rituals, and collective responsibility. In Tartarian cities, buildings themselves seem to have carried symbolic functions. Domes, spires, geometric layouts, and precise alignments appear repeatedly, even in places thousands of kilometers apart. These were not labeled as churches, yet they occupied central positions in public space. Some researchers believe these structures functioned as harmonic centers, places where sound, light, and proportion influenced communal states of mind. No altar, no pulpit, no hierarchy. Just space, resonance, and participation. Governance in these regions also reflected an unusual integration of belief and administration. Laws were not framed as divine commandments handed down by an authority claiming exclusive access to truth. Instead, moral order seemed embedded in custom, tradition, and shared accountability. Decisions were made publicly, rituals marked seasonal transitions, and remembrance was collective rather than doctrinal. Faith did not demand obedience. It required presence. This form of belief becomes even more intriguing when compared to what was happening elsewhere during the same period. Western Europe was consolidating nation-states, standardizing religion, and expanding institutional power. Churches were not just spiritual centers, they were tools of administration, taxation, and ideological control. In that context, a vast territory operating without formal religious institutions was not merely different, it was incompatible. As maps changed, so did narratives. Tartaria slowly disappeared from official records, fragmented into empires, renamed, reorganized. Along with borders, belief systems shifted. New religions were introduced, often described as bringing civilization, order, and truth. But what if they were not replacing chaos, but overwriting a system that did not fit centralized control? Some monuments attributed to later regimes raise uncomfortable questions. Why do certain buildings defy the architectural logic of the cultures credited with constructing them? Why do restoration records often appear decades after their supposed creation? And why do early photographs show these structures already aged, already complete, with no documentation of their origin? These questions do not prove a hidden past, but they invite doubt, and doubt is where historical inquiry begins. More unsettling is the speed with which Tartarian belief faded without recorded resistance. There were no great religious wars, no mass persecutions documented on the scale seen elsewhere. Instead, belief dissolved through education reforms, administrative restructuring, and the quiet redefinition of what religion was supposed to be. When faith requires no church, it becomes invisible to institutions that only recognize power when it has a throne. What remains today are fragments, symbols without explanations, traditions disconnected from their origins, stories labeled as folklore because they no longer align with official timelines, and perhaps most telling, a persistent discomfort whenever Tartaria is mentioned, as if the subject itself challenges an agreement history has made with silence. As we move forward, we must ask whether Tartaria lost its faith or whether the world simply lost the ability to recognize it. Because if belief can exist without temples, without intermediaries, and without imposed doctrine, then the question becomes dangerous. Who decides what counts as religion and why? And that question leads us directly into what replaced Tartarian belief, how it was reframed, and why its disappearance may not have been accidental at all. As Tartaria faded from maps, something else expanded in its place: standardized belief systems, rigid doctrines, and institutions that defined faith through buildings, titles, and obedience. This transition did not happen overnight, and it did not arrive with open violence. It arrived through classification, through census records, through education, through the quiet declaration that belief must now have an approved form to be considered legitimate. In newly reorganized territories, administrators began to describe Tartarian regions as spiritually empty, backward, or undefined. This framing was crucial. A land without recognized religion could be presented as a land in need of guidance. Missionaries followed bureaucrats. Schools followed missionaries. And with schools came a new language, a new moral structure, and a new definition of truth. What makes this shift unusual is how little resistance appears in official records. No widespread uprisings defending ancient temples, no manifestos proclaiming forbidden doctrines. Instead, local customs were rebranded as superstition, architecture was reassigned new purposes, and communal rituals were either absorbed into sanctioned religions or quietly discouraged until they lost meaning. When belief is embedded in daily life rather than text, it can be dismantled simply by changing how life itself is organized. Some historians argue that Tartaria never had a unified religion to erase, only loose cultural practices. But this explanation struggles to address the coherence visible across enormous distances. Similar architectural principles, comparable civic layouts, shared symbolic motifs. These are not the marks of randomness. They suggest a worldview transmitted without scripture, maintained without clergy, and understood without enforcement. One of the most provocative theories proposes that Tartarian belief operated through resonance rather than revelation. That harmony, balance, and alignment were not metaphors, but lived principles. Buildings were constructed to amplify sound and light in specific ways. Public gatherings were timed to natural cycles. Even governance followed patterns meant to maintain equilibrium rather than dominance. If this is true, then replacing such a system would require more than banning it. It would require redefining reality itself, and that redefinition came with modernity. Time was standardized. Calendars were adjusted. Education emphasized linear progress rather than cyclical return. Faith became something taught rather than experienced, something written rather than felt. Under these conditions, a belief system without texts, without sermons, and without a central authority would not be attacked. It would simply become unintelligible. There is also the question of why Tartaria is so often treated as a myth today. Major encyclopedias once listed it as a real region. Maps from respected institutions labeled it clearly, yet modern narratives dismiss it as a vague term used by Europeans who did not understand Asia. This sudden reinterpretation raises a subtle concern. When does correction become erasure? Consider how history handles inconvenient complexity. It simplifies, it narrows, it chooses continuity over contradiction. A decentralized belief system that functioned without churches contradicts the assumption that religion naturally evolves toward hierarchy. If Tartaria existed as described, it suggests that faith does not require control to endure. And that idea threatens every institution built on spiritual authority. Some researchers point to inconsistencies in restoration timelines, particularly in cities attributed to later empires. Structures displaying advanced engineering appear before the technological explanations used to justify them. Decorative motifs are stripped during renovations, replaced with symbols aligned to newer religions. These acts are always described as preservation, never transformation. Yet preservation of what exactly? Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that Tartarian belief was not destroyed because it was weak, but because it was resilient. A system that cannot be centralized cannot be owned. A faith without intermediaries cannot be taxed. A spiritual life embedded in everyday behavior cannot be easily monitored. For expanding states and organized religions, absorption was the only viable strategy. By the mid-1800s, Tartaria no longer existed as a named entity. Its people were citizens of new empires. Its buildings were repurposed. Its belief system had no label, and what has no name cannot be defended. It simply fades into background noise, mistaken for nothing at all. Yet traces remain, and they grow louder the closer one listens. And to understand those traces, we must examine the symbols, structures and silences that survived the transition. The symbols left behind by Tartaria are often dismissed as decorative, yet their repetition across continents suggests intention rather than coincidence. Star-shaped city layouts, precise axial alignments, domes crowned with finials and recurring geometric patterns appear in regions later claimed by entirely different cultures. Official explanations describe these similarities as parallel development or borrowed aesthetics. But parallel development rarely produces this level of uniformity without shared principles. In many former Tartarian areas, the most prominent structures were not palaces or churches, but multifunctional buildings whose original purpose remains undefined. Today they are called administrative halls, exhibition centers, or simply monuments. Their interiors often feature unusual acoustics, curved surfaces, and materials chosen not for durability alone, but for resonance. Whispering galleries, harmonic chambers, and echo-amplifying domes are treated as architectural curiosities. But what if they were functional components of a belief system based on collective experience? Some researchers propose that Tartarian spirituality relied on frequency, vibration, and coherence, not as mystical abstractions, but as practical tools for social harmony. Sound, light, and proportion would have shaped emotional states during communal gatherings. In this framework, belief was not something declared, it was something induced, shared, and stabilized through environment. No sermons were needed when space itself instructed the mind. This may explain why written doctrine appears largely absent. Text fixes meaning, it creates authority. A belief system grounded in experience remains fluid, adaptable, and difficult to corrupt. But it is also difficult to record. When later historians searched for Tartarian religion, they looked for books, clergy, and dogma. Finding none, they concluded there was nothing to find. Yet absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when the criteria for recognition are narrow by design. If faith must resemble modern religion to qualify as real, then anything outside that frame becomes invisible. This raises an uncomfortable possibility that history did not fail to record Tartarian belief, but actively filtered it out. Consider how symbols were reinterpreted. Star geometry became military iconography. Domes were reassigned religious meaning aligned with incoming faiths. Seasonal rituals were reframed as cultural festivals, stripped of spiritual significance. Each transformation appeared benign, even progressive, but layered together, they performed a subtle operation. Continuity without memory. There is also the question of technology. Some Tartarian structures exhibit engineering feats that challenge the timelines assigned to them. Stone blocks of immense weight fitted without visible mortar. Metallic elements placed in ways that suggest conductive intent. Alignment with magnetic or celestial markers that served no apparent purpose under later use. These features are explained away as decorative or coincidental, but coincidence loses credibility when patterns repeat globally. More provocative still is the suggestion that Tartarian belief blurred the line between the spiritual and the practical. Governance, architecture, and ritual were not separate domains. They reinforced one another. To dismantle such a system, it would not be enough to ban worship. One would need to redesign cities, redefine education, and restructure daily life, which is precisely what happened during the expansion of modern states. Schools taught new histories. Calendars emphasized progress over recurrence. Religion was confined to designated spaces, removed from governance and infrastructure. Faith became personal, then optional, then abstract. In that environment, a belief system rooted in collective rhythm could not survive intact. It was not defeated, it was dissolved. Still, something resisted complete erasure. Why do certain symbols continue to appear in national emblems long after their supposed origins were forgotten? Why do architectural restorations so often remove elements later deemed unnecessary or unexplainable? And why does the subject of Tartaria provoke such strong reactions, ranging from ridicule to outright dismissal instead of calm examination? Perhaps because acknowledging its belief system would force a reconsideration of how power, faith, and history interact. And that reconsideration leads directly to the forces that benefited most from Tartaria's disappearance. When Tartaria vanished as a recognized entity, the beneficiaries were not abstract forces, but emerging powers that required uniformity to function. Empires, bureaucracies, and institutional religions all depend on predictability. Borders must be clear. Belief must be definable. Authority must flow in one direction. A decentralized system of faith, woven into everyday life and resistant to ownership, stood in direct opposition to that model. As new administrations took control of former Tartarian regions, one pattern repeats consistently: reclassification. Lands were surveyed, renamed, and reorganized. Populations were categorized. Traditions were labeled. What could not be categorized was ignored. What could not be ignored was reframed. This process did not require deception, only selective emphasis. History does not need to lie if it chooses carefully what to remember. Religious institutions played a crucial role in this transition, not necessarily as conspirators, but as beneficiaries of a changing world. When belief was localized and experiential, it did not travel well across borders. But standardized doctrine could be exported, taught, replicated. It aligned perfectly with imperial expansion. Faith became portable, transmissible, and enforceable. In contrast, Tartarian belief, if it truly relied on environment and shared presence, could not survive displacement. This may explain why Tartarian architecture was often preserved, but spiritually neutralized. Buildings were not destroyed, they were reassigned. A structure that once served as a communal harmonic center could become a courthouse, a museum, or a cathedral. The shell remained. The function changed. Future generations would see the building and assume it had always served its new purpose. Memory was overwritten without rubble. There is something particularly telling about how silence surrounds this transition. No official decree banning Tartarian belief exists. No council condemning its practices. Silence suggests something more effective than force. It suggests absorption so complete that opposition never crystallized. When a worldview is reframed as obsolete rather than forbidden, people abandon it willingly, believing they are choosing progress. Some documents from the 18th and 19th centuries hint at unease among observers. Descriptions of cities described as orderly yet strange. Populations characterized as disciplined but difficult to categorize spiritually. These accounts often end abruptly, replaced in later editions by more conventional explanations. Revision does not always erase. Sometimes it smooths. A subtle but persistent question remains unanswered. If Tartaria had no churches, why did later regimes feel the need to place churches so precisely where Tartarian structures once stood? Why do these locations consistently occupy the most symbolically and geographically central points? This replacement pattern suggests more than convenience. It suggests succession. Even more intriguing is the psychological shift that accompanied this transformation. Faith, once collective and embedded, became internal and private. Responsibility shifted from shared rhythm to personal belief. This change mirrors the rise of individualism and centralized authority. When belief becomes internal, governance no longer needs to account for it. Power and spirituality separate and control becomes simpler. Critics argue that these interpretations rely too heavily on speculation, and they are right to be cautious. But speculation becomes necessary when records are incomplete, when explanations conflict, and when patterns emerge without acknowledgement. The discomfort around Tartaria may stem not from falsehood, but from implication. Accepting that a large-scale society functioned with belief, but without churches, forces a reconsideration of what religion is and who it serves. As the 19th century progressed, the last traces of Tartarian identity dissolved into national histories. Children learned new pasts, symbols lost context, architecture stood mute, and belief, once visible in the rhythm of daily life, became a matter of personal conscience rather than communal structure. Yet questions persist, and they lead to the most unsettling possibility of all, that Tartaria's faith was not erased because it failed, but because it worked too well. If Tartaria's belief system truly functioned without churches, without clergy, and without imposed doctrine, then its disappearance forces one final question. Was it erased from history, or was history restructured so that it could no longer be seen? The difference matters, because one implies destruction, while the other implies replacement so thorough that memory itself became unnecessary. By the mid-19th century, the world had largely agreed on what religion was supposed to look like. It had buildings, hierarchies, texts, and approved interpretations. Anything outside that framework was either classified as culture, myth, or primitive custom. Tartarian belief, lacking all recognizable markers, failed the test of legitimacy. not because it was false, but because it was incompatible with the system judging it. This reframing had lasting consequences. Once belief is defined institutionally, freedom of faith appears to increase, while actual diversity decreases. Different doctrines may compete, but they all obey the same structural rules. Tartaria, if it existed as described, represented something else entirely, a form of belief that could not be competed with, only replaced. It did not demand loyalty, so it could not be defended politically. It did not declare truth, so it could not argue its case. The most unsettling aspect is how modern society still carries echoes of this lost system without recognizing their origin. Public spaces designed for gathering feel empty without explanation. Architecture that evokes awe without religious instruction leaves people uneasy. Symbols persist in flags, emblems, and city layouts, stripped of meaning, yet still capable of stirring something difficult to name. These are residues of a worldview that once operated beneath consciousness rather than above it. There is also a subtle conspiracy in the way Tartaria is treated today. Not a secret meeting, not a hidden cabal, but a shared agreement to stop asking certain questions. The moment Tartaria is mentioned, discussion shifts from evidence to ridicule. Curiosity becomes suspect. Doubt is framed as ignorance. This reaction is not accidental. It is how intellectual boundaries are enforced without force. If Tartarian belief truly emphasized harmony, resonance, and shared rhythm, then its quiet disappearance makes sense. Such a system cannot be conquered. It can only be drowned out. And noise, in the form of endless information, competing doctrines, and fragmented attention, is the most effective eraser of all. Perhaps the greatest irony is that Tartaria's faith may not be gone at all. It may simply no longer be recognized as faith. It may survive in moments of collective silence, in the way certain spaces affect human behavior, in the instinctive pull toward balance that persists despite ideological division. If so, then history did not eliminate Tartarian belief. It outgrew the language needed to describe it. What remains is not proof but possibility, and possibility is dangerous because it invites re-examination. If belief once existed without churches, then modern definitions are not inevitable. They are choices. Choices shaped by power, convenience, and control. The question is no longer whether Tartaria had a faith without churches. The question is why such an idea feels so threatening today, and whether what was lost was not a religion, but an alternative way of being human together. And now, having followed this path to its end, the investigation does not close. It opens outward, into the silence history leaves behind, waiting for those willing to listen.